Listen, Simon Rosenberg here from Hopium Chronicles. Welcome, folks. We've got a great event here. We're live on Substack Live. I've got my dear friend, Tom Bonier, is joining us. Tom and I have been sort of frick and frack or Abbott and Costello over the last, in the data world over the last few years. We've been doing a lot of work together. Tom, just recently, I was lucky enough to see a showing of some new research that Tom unveiled at a private gathering with state party chairs just a few weeks ago in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I asked him to come on and share that presentation with us today. And so, Tom, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with y'all. And yeah, like you said, this is the first time we'll actually be sharing this data and this analysis outside of that room we both presented in a few weeks ago. So I'm excited to share this with the community here.
Yeah, and Tom and I did our decks in parallel, and in fact, he borrowed some of the stuff that I did for today. But let's get to it, Tom. I mean, you know, for those of you who don't know Tom, he's the head of an organization called the Terror Group that includes Target Smart. He was the CEO of Target Smart, but he did such a good job there. He got bumped upstairs over the last year, and is one of the smartest and best political analysts that we have, and a dear friend. And so I'm really glad he's here with us today. And let's get to it. Tom, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So to set it at first, what I'm going to do here, I know we've all heard a lot about 2024 already. And so I'm going to talk about it a little bit more if you bear with me, because we have some really important data. For those who might not know, a lot of this analysis relies on individual vote history. It's the record of who actually voted in the election. And it just takes a real long time for some states to pull that together. So you're going to see sort of an arc of this. And this isn't a super long presentation, I promise. We distilled this down to just the key points. But we're going to talk a little bit about what we now know about how Trump won this election. But I think more importantly, putting in the context of what's happening now, where do things stand? And then I think really closing out on where the opportunities are in front of us. So with that, I'm going to jump right forward here. Two main points. If I had to summarize this question of how Trump won, and I think there are many ways you could define this, but two key points, at least in terms of the analysis that I've been looking at. Number one, he redefined himself with little or late opposition. And we'll talk more about that. I know Simon has talked about that and written about that a fair amount. But I think that's a key element in terms of how he was able to define himself and really redefine the conception of truth, especially among these, you know, lower information or lower political engagement voters who were so critically important, and these late deciders where he really won the election. And then, you know, and this is where we're going to spend most of the time, and most of the slides you'll see here. There really wasn't that much of an intensity advantage in terms of when you look at the difference between Republican supporters, Trump voters, and Democrats, Harris voters. You know, I think there's been this perception that there was this massive turnout advantage, that the Elon Musk machine really just ran over Democrats, that Democrats were depressed and stayed home. And as you will see, there's actually some important nuance to this that will emerge in this data. It wasn't that. There were actually, in the battleground states, very minimal variations in terms of turnout compared to the winning Democratic electorate in 2020 relative to the Republican electorate. The bigger problem was what had happened over the preceding 4 years, where there were just not enough Democrats because Republicans had really beaten Democrats, frankly, pretty substantially on the registration game. And as we talked about, you know, with this community, Simon and I talked about a fair amount leading up to the election. After Vice President Harris became the nominee, you saw that gap begin to close, that registration gap, but there just wasn't enough time to make up for the deficit over the previous 4 years. So, you know, this is really just the summary here. What you're going to see is I'm going to break down states. For this analysis, we're just going to look at the party registration states. That's the data we're talking about. We have the data for all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. But for this analysis, just to keep it transparent, we want to limit to states where you could register with a political party. In other states, we use modeled partisanship. But because that's an internal model that we build, I wanted to remove any concerns in terms of how that model could vary from state to state and just rely on the partisan registration states, because it's a good number of states and a majority of voters live in one of these states. So first, just when you look at what happened, the obvious, and I think we're all well aware of this, but overall, Trump did exactly 3 points better in 2024 nationally than he did in 2020. But if you limit that to the 7 battleground states, his increase was actually less than 2%. That might seem like a small amount, but that's obviously substantial, relevant, and important. If you look at the non-battleground states, it was actually what we consider the safe blue states, the states that have been reliably Democratic, where Trump saw his biggest vote share increases. And again, Simon has talked about this more clearly and frankly earlier than anyone else, really going back to the 2022 elections, where we saw what Simon called the 2 elections. That extended into 2024, where if you're analyzing the election, it really doesn't lend itself to national, broad, sweeping statements. You really have to break out the non-battleground states and the battleground states. And frankly, even within the non-battleground states, you have to break out the red and the blue states. So this is the first look at some of the data. This is just comparing Trump's increase in the percent of the vote, his popular vote share, from 2020 to 2024. This is, again, in this case, this is every single state, because we're not using turnout or registration data. This is just looking at what percent of the vote he won. And so New York was his biggest gain. He gained over 5 points. Now you see this mix, right? New York, Florida, New Jersey, California, Texas. If those states sound familiar, to the point I made a moment ago, the states where Democrats dropped off the most in 2022 relative to 2018, these are the same states for the most part. So you see it as a mix of, so-called blue states and red states. But if you look at the aggregates in there, the blue non-battleground states were the biggest increase for Trump, or drop off for Democrats. Then the red non-battleground states. And then finally the battleground states further down, where you had, again, Trump increased by less than 2%. Now, if we look at this is now registered Republicans. We're going to start to look at turnout. And so what we're looking at here is seeing the change in what percent of the total turnout. So what percent of the people who voted in 2024 were registered Republicans, and comparing that share to 2020. Because again, the initial consideration was that Republicans just beat Democrats in turnout. And when you look at this chart, initially you look at it and say, well, maybe that was the case. So if you look at these red non-battleground states, the net increase in the Republican share of the electorate was 8 points. That's pretty massive. It actually sort of flips what we saw on that last chart in terms of what Trump did. In the blue non-battleground states, Republicans really didn't substantially increase their share of the electorate. Their net increase was just over 2%. In the battleground states, it was just over 4%. So Republicans did account for a larger share of the electorate relative to Democrats relative to 2020. So again, if this was all you were able to look at, you would say, okay, well, I guess Republicans did beat us in turnout, and that's what we need to focus on and calibrate around, and that's the lesson learned going into the midterms next year. But now, if we look at turnout percent, so the change in turnout percent as a percent of registered voters, and I know I'm getting deep into the weeds with the numbers here, and I promise we'll wrap this all up with a neat and tidy bow to make sense, but this is important. So this isn't looking at what percent of the electorate was registered Republicans versus Democrats. This is just looking at what percent of Democrats and Republicans turned out. So it's the percent of the bigger pie, which is all registered voters. And you see something different here. Actually, in some states, the net difference in turnout as a percent of registration actually got more Democratic than it was in 2020. Now, yes, most of these are non-competitive states, but look at Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, when you look at the difference in Democratic turnout relative to 2020, Republican turnout relative to 2020, Democrats outperformed Republicans in terms of turnout. If you look at the aggregate, and I'm going to come back to that, the battleground states, this is the difference here. It was just a fraction of a percent. in the battleground states, meaning turnout as a percent of registration, Democrats versus Republicans, comparing 2024 to 2020, it was basically a wash. There was almost no difference in the battleground states. In fact, the biggest differences came in the red non-battleground states, where, yes, Democratic turnout was depressed relative to Republican turnout. In the blue non-battleground states, not so much. Again, it was still less than 1%. So how did this happen? How does that math all add up? How does that math work? Because I just told you that Republicans were a larger share of the electorate across every state that has party registration. Yet in the end, the turnout numbers were basically a wash. And I already stepped on the headline here, but I want to share the actual data. The key rationale for this, how this happened, was because Democratic registration in almost every state actually declined. And in fact, the Democratic share of registered voters in all 7 battleground states, when you compare 2020 to 2024, declined in all of them, meaning Democrats accounted for a smaller share of registered voters in those states in 2024 relative to 2020, whereas Republicans gained in Arizona and Pennsylvania. This is answering the question in Pennsylvania. How did Democrats actually do better in turnout percent but lose vote share? Well, because there were so many more registered Republicans than there were in 2020. And so in the rest of the states, the net gain was unaffiliated voters. And look, this is, let me just show you the numbers here in terms of registration. So this is a breakdown of these battleground states that have party registration. And so you see here, this is a change in the share of all registered voters between 2020 and 2024. You see Democratic drop in Pennsylvania, Republican increase, and unaffiliated increase. In Nevada, massive drop for Democrats and share of registered voters. Drop for Republicans too. This is a little bit misleading in Nevada because they implemented automatic voter registration. And so the people who are registering to vote were overwhelmingly unaffiliated voters. In North Carolina, big drop in Democrats, small drop in Republicans, big gain in unaffiliated, and so on and so forth. Non-battlegrounds, either side, still Democratic drops in registration, Republican increases. These unaffiliated voters are important. And I'm going to dig into this next, and I only have a few more slides here. But I talked about the beginning when I said, how did Trump win? And I talked about this sort of uncontested issue environment where he was able to win, especially with these lower information voters. Well, something that I was looking at in the lead up to 2024 was this increase with unaffiliated voters. And yes, many of them looked like Democrats. They were younger. There was a substantial number of voters of color. I certainly had the hope at that time that these voters would vote Democratic, and certainly a large number of them did. But the reality is Trump had this uncontested issue environment where he was truly able to shape what these people believed to be true, to believe that he was a good president in his first term, to not hear about January 6th, to not hear about the felonies. And so enough of those voters went Republican to create this critical mass and allow him to expand his vote share. This is just a breakdown of all of the party registration states and the net Republican share gain just in registration. So if you want a report card on how we Democrats did over the 2020 to 2024 period in voter registration, the answer is here. As I alluded to earlier, Republicans increased relative to Democrats in share of registered voters in literally every party registration state. Their biggest gains, again, were in the red non-battleground states, but substantial gains in the battleground states. Less so in the blue states. But you see some of these states with massive increases. Well, there were just more Republicans, so they could survive not having any sort of intensity advantage. When Vice President Harris came in and you saw the intensity and enthusiasm, you saw these increases in registration, and we were looking at this and saying, look, Democrats are not depressed in these battleground states. They are ready to come out. Well, they did, but we just didn't have enough of them given these registration deficits that had built up over the previous 3.5 years. Okay. That's the meat of the data. Now I want to talk a little bit just about the issue environment, and then where we are now with the registration. And so again, I've said this before, but in general, if I wanted to summarize this, I'd say he was the beneficiary of a general lack of an effort to disqualify him. And again, Simon has written about this far more eloquently and thoroughly than I ever could. And so I imagine you all are already familiar with that, and I'm not going to go further down that path. But if you look at the polling here, these are the Navigator polls. This was all available before the election, by the way. If you look at the dates, I'm sorry, this is post-election. I have some pre-election polls. But if you look at this, and this to me is painful in so many ways, looking at just the swing voters as Navigator defined them, the swing voters had a net plus 22 approval for Trump's first term in office. Now, again, these swing voters tend to be lower information. They tend to consume less political information. I have a poll number on that in a moment. So we have to keep in mind a lot of them are forming their political opinions based on what they were consuming over the course of last year, a lot of which wasn't explicitly political content. Now, and again, it was all there for the taking. They didn't like him. They were net -7. They had a net unfavorable, a majority unfavorable opinion of him, yet this impression that he was a good president. He was not disqualified, I think, is the takeaway for this. Now, here's just sort of the showing our math on the point that we've been making about these lower information voters. This is from G. Elliott Morris and some great data that he has put together. This is looking at, again, the 2024 electorate broken down by the question of how much political information do you consume. And you see this very straight line correlation where the more political news you consume, the better off Vice President Harris was. Actually won by 6 points, people who consume a great deal of political information. But here's where the election was lost. People who said they consume only a little or none at all, a group that was lost by 19 points. Again, their entire conception of truth was changed. This wasn't something that could easily be modified or overwritten in the last 3 weeks of the election. And so you see the damage that was done in the failure to have a major disqualification effort and to hold resources until the last month or so of the election, as happened in this campaign. So where are we now? I have a few slides on this, and I'd love to get into discussion and questions. But, well, here's the good news. And I'm going to have some good news and I think some opportunity news when I talk about where we are, because it's not all, good news. It's what you all know to be true. There's work to be done. But if you look at President Trump's job approval and you see this sort of steady, and actually this is dated, this chart here only, I have some more recent numbers that Simon said he shared with me from his presentation. I'll share, I think, on the next slide. But you see this sort of steady increase in Trump disapproval, steady decline in approval, as you all know, being a historically unpopular president based on where he is at this point in his presidency compared to other presidents. But a key element here, to go back to the slide 2 slides ago, where we talked about these lower information voters. And again, this is from G. Elliott Morris. So I want to give him credit because he does great work. What's driving that fall in approval ratings? Well, it's really across the board. But the biggest declines are among these same people who won the election for Trump in terms of the overperformance, the people who say they hardly pay attention to politics at all. These people have had a massive net decline, in this case, a net 33-point margin decline. That's massive. This is a slide I stole from Simon, but this is incredibly important. And again, I know you've all heard this from Simon. Simon, I'm sure you'll want to talk about this more in a minute. But when you look at the coalition, it's not just in terms of these lower information voters. They make up a lot of these different demographic groups. But when you look at his overperformance with younger voters, with voters of color, with lower information voters, lower income voters, these are exactly who he is losing. Meaning, for all the breathless analysis that we saw in the weeks after the election of how Trump had absolutely reshaped American politics and this new emerging coalition that Republicans had formed as if it was a massive realignment. Well, if it was a realignment, it's realigned back away from him. just in the first 5 months of his presidency. Now I'll end with this cautionary tale. When I say Trump's losses aren't necessarily our gains yet, I want to add a caveat. I mean, they actually very much are our gains. If you look at the special elections that have happened, you look at any of the elections that have happened since Trump took office, we're back to seeing those Democratic overperformances that we have been seeing post-Dobbs, and that's important. And I would say, and I'm not going to make a prediction on the midterms here, 17 months or 16 months before the midterms, but I think it is safe to say that Democrats are very much poised to overperform due to Trump's wild unpopularity. How unpopular he is, how unpopular his agenda is, how extreme he has been. But the caveat that I will add is a lot of this isn't being driven at this point based on popularity of Democrats. It's not to say that the Democratic agenda isn't unpopular, but we struggle in this issue environment. And so you aren't seeing that proactive positivity around Democrats, at least in these same indicators that we were talking about over the previous 4 years. And so I'll look at voter registration, and this is where I'll end. I'll share some new voter registration data. This is just a random, well, it's not entirely random, but it's a sampling of states that have party registration, where I wanted to take a sample of some blue states, some red states, and then some states where they have elections this year to show you what has happened. And so these charts, they compare new voter registration over this certain period of time. In this case, the period of time that we're looking at is since Trump's inauguration, January 20th, through the most recent voter registration update. So in each of these states, it'll be over the last handful of weeks. And then compare it to that same period in time 4 and 8 years ago. It's a nice way to be able to see how things are trending. And generally, we want to see favorable numbers here. We want to see more people registering as Democrats. Well, in Rhode Island, a blue state, you see where 8 years ago, new registrants were about plus 19 Democrat. Right now, they're about plus 16. So, not a massive drop, but again, to the extent that we would look at that and hope to see more people registering Democrats because of Trump popularity, you're not seeing that. In this red state, West Virginia, formerly blue state, you see something even different. Actually, big increases in Republican registration. New Jersey, where we have important elections this year, including the gubernatorial, state legislative elections. 8 years ago, what we saw was new registrants were about plus 16 Democratic. 4 years ago, plus 17 Democratic. Right now, they're just about plus 9 Democratic. So again, New Jersey was one of the states that saw one of the biggest drop-offs in Democratic support between 2020 and 2024, where you did see actual deficiencies in Democratic turnout. So again, I offer this as a cautionary flag. Are Democrats still poised to overperform in the elections there because of Trump's unpopularity? Yes. Could Democrats do even more if we're able to generate positive enthusiasm and positive association with the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates? Absolutely, yes. Does that mean there's important work and opportunities in front of us, this community, and generally activists in this party? Yes, and you'll see the same sort of trend in Nevada. We will continue to share, and Simon and I have been talking about this. We're looking for the right way to do this, but we will continue to share these registration updates. For me, look, this is not definitive of everything. The polling data is incredibly important. It shows opportunity. But to me, this is a little bit of a report card of how we're doing. I want to see these Democratic registration numbers increase. So, Simon, I'm gonna pause there, and I'd love to
let's get it. Yeah, let me, Lincoln, if you can bring us both back. We're pushing the bounds of the technology here, and hopefully we will come back. There we are. Good to see you, my friend.
Likewise.
So we've been getting questions from the audience, and let me just start with a few that I've seen and just also some things. I mean, what you're saying, the bottom line here, right, on this data is that we got beat in voter registration and in between 20 and 2024, and it contributed to our loss in the election, which suggests then that there needs to be a much greater commitment in the family to voter registration. That they Turning Point USA, Elon's PAC, they all spent enormous amounts of money on voter reg. And as we've often discussed here, historically, Democrats outsource their voter registration to C3 and C4 groups, meaning that we haven't done partisan voter registration as a national party in 20 years. I mean, since this new campaign finance era that we've been in. And the new team, Ken Martin, Jane Klebb, have indicated that they're going to make partisan voter registration great again for the Democrats. It's what your data suggests is that this is actually really important.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. And I really think of it in two ways. And I actually like to throw a question back to you on this, because I think when you look at the registration deficiency over the 4-year period of 2020 to 2024, to me, there's two elements of it. One, I think the substantial element of it is what you just referred to. It was that we didn't have the same sort of investment in it, perhaps, as we have had in the past. And to the extent that we did have it, a lot of it was outsourced, and that can be challenging, especially when you do have, maybe 10 plus years ago, you could do what we call sort of blind demographic registration, right? You could register people based on demographics and not have to worry about partisanship. And things have shifted enough that I don't think that's adequate. And so I think there's that end that they just invested, meaning Republicans, invested far more in this. I mean, Elon Musk spending the money he spent, like you said, it was Scott, what's his name, the Republican guy who does a lot of this voter registration. They had successes, and I think we have to give them credit. The other element of this, though, is I think a little bit more nebulous, which is this sort of broad sense of how people view the party. And I think there were some deficiencies there as well, right? That Democrats, and you were, again, the loudest voice on this front over that time period, saying, look, we have to be out there taking more credit for our achievements. There's one slide that I ended up cutting to limit this down to where I needed to be for the presentation a few weeks ago, but you've talked about this a lot. If you look at that same Navigator polling, they show frustratingly that in April of 2024, a large number of voters gave credit to Donald Trump for the Infrastructure Act and said that Republicans had done more on infrastructure. People were generally not aware of the great accomplishments of the Biden administration, which were significant and substantial, but we didn't have that effort. I think it's what led you, a year out, to tell people to turn the campaign on with the message that we have advantages here, but we have to talk about it. And so I think that was part of the registration deficiency too, is a lot of people are going out to register to vote, and they didn't, when they saw the box to check for Democrat, a lot of them just checked unaffiliated because they didn't make that connection for what Democrats were fighting for. And so I think it's both. I think we have to do both of those things. But I'm curious of your take about that sort of dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the Biden-Harris thing struggled to tell their story. And, it was, in what was a very close election, and where, we won down ballot in many of these same states, and where we actually picked up a House seat in North Carolina, we won 5 out of the 10 statewide seats. I mean, we had a lot of, we had meaningful and important victories in critical states in 2024. I think there was a big story in the Atlantic magazine this week about the divergence in strategy between the campaign and Future Forward. And I think that, we just had I think that Biden's struggles made it harder for us to communicate to folks. There was interference in our ability to tell our story. I think that what happened with Biden's debate performance is that it became not solely about him, but it became about us. It became about us not being strong enough to have forced him out and to have, put forward a nominee that was more capable of serving the 4 years, right? Because there was just, and I think that Biden's weakness became a party-wide weakness. And I think Kamala Harris's team was given an impossible assignment. I mean, they had to take over in very difficult circumstances and tell her story and her bio. And I think that this issue that you raise, I mean, I often talk about this, and you've raised it today, and is that, in the largest margin of victory that we've had since 1964 was in the 1996 reelect. Clinton won by more than 8 points. And in that election, the campaign went up with negative ads against the likely Republican nominee, Bob Dole, in the fall of 1995. And we defined him early and went up and roughed him up, and the election was never close. In the Cook Report's analysis of why we did better in the Senate races down ballot than we did in the presidential election in 2024, their central conclusion was that the Senate majority PAC went up early and defined the Republicans, the Senate candidates, early and disqualified them in a way that made it very difficult for them to recover. We, as a national party, chose not to do that with Trump, even though he became the putative nominee in February and March. When I ran a national media campaign in 2004, we went up on the air in March and stayed up on the air in Spanish for 8 months. It's not uncommon for super PACs to sort of fill in the gap, right, during this period, and just, to go out early and go negative. But our super PAC made a decision not to do that. And I think, to your point, the other stat that I still kind of struggle to comprehend is that one of the questions in the exit polls were, do you feel optimistic, enthusiastic, worried, concerned, or something about the nominee of each of the candidates? And 49% of the people who voted on Election Day felt optimistic or enthusiastic about Trump's presidency. That's a crazy number, right? Yeah. Given his own negatives and given the negatives of his agenda, we simply, for a lot of these low information voters or low political information voters, no one's low information in America anymore, right? Is that low political information voters, they had not heard the negatives. The negatives on Trump did not reach them, and we're not part of their understanding, because, as you pointed out, all the measures of of 49% of voters believed they were optimistic and enthusiastic about his presidency, as opposed to terrified, right? And there was just I think Kamala was given a very hard assignment to tell her story in a very quick period of time. But I think the inability to levy the hard negative against him, which is what every super PAC does in every election, allowed him, one of the slides that you didn't mention that I think was in your earlier presentation, or a version of it, was, his approval rating went up through the entire election, as if there was no campaign run against him. So I do think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from 2024. The mistakes were costly. It's hurting the country, right? We're a weaker nation because of Trump's presidency. But for me, the big takeaway from your work, and now that we had this additional, can you explain to everybody the difference between the way that you arrived at these conclusions and the inputs of them, right? The individual voter file versus exit polling, other stuff. Can you go into the guts of that a little bit? Because I don't know that people necessarily understand that, and why, this is sort of, you're operating from a much more complete longitudinal data set than like an exit poll or a poll.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in the exit polls, obviously the polls and exit polls benefit from recency and currency, right? They can crank out an exit poll, so we're looking at them in some cases before the polls close, and those sort of congeal our conception or perception of what happened in the election. And the problem is, those are just polls. They're like any other poll in that they suffer from sample bias, response bias, things like that. To put it more simply, they don't know who voted. The voter file does. So the file that our team collects and builds and aggregates, it's over, it's all 200 some odd million registered voters in the United States. And we maintain a file on who voted and didn't in every single election. It's publicly available data. And we can cross-reference that with all of the other data points we have at the individual level, that it's not overwhelmingly modeled data, that we do have models on there. It's self-reported data in terms of partisan registration, party primary history, things like that, donation records. And so that gives us the most robust sense of what happened, at least who voted. And so if we can fill in that one side of the algebraic equation and compare it to 2020, then leaves you with the remainder of anything that is not explained by the turnout. Generally is going to be the persuasion element, the vote switching element. And no doubt there was a fair amount of that in this election, though it appears to be that was mostly limited to these safe blue states where you did have more crossover voting to 2020. But yeah, this data set, it's it's all the vote history. It's the 100 some odd million people who voted in this election, where we know exactly who they are, where they are, their partisan registration, which elections they voted in the past. We can look at who stayed home, voted in 2020 and stayed home in 2024, or the new voters. And so that's the basis for this analysis. And it's why, oftentimes people ask us, what's the margin of error in this analysis? Because we're used to that in polling. And the things that I'm characterizing for you in this presentation, there isn't a margin of error. This is the actual data. It's exactly what happened in voter registration and turnout. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. But to me, it paints a very clear picture of what happened, and the increase in Republican voter registration, the decrease in Democratic voter registration, and two bases of partisanship that were roughly equal in terms of their turnout intensity. I mean, one way to view it, to me, that maybe it's somewhat depressing, but I think it paints an important picture here, is that we remember the 2020 election where there was a record-setting turnout, and that Democratic turnout was quite robust, and that was a big part of how President Biden won that election. Well, based on these registration changes, if the relative turnout, Democrat to Republican turnout, was equal to what it was in 2020, Vice President Harris still would have lost, just because there were more Republicans. They had a bigger share of the pie than they did in 2020. And so I don't, to the extent that people are looking at this and they're saying, well, she lost because Democrats stayed home, Democrats weren't there. You can always make that argument. There are tens of millions of voters who stay home in any election. You can make that for either side in any election. But relative to this election where Democrats won through great advantages in turnout, even that wouldn't have been enough in this, which, it was a very close election, even though from an electoral perspective it wasn't. In terms of the actual margins in the battleground states, it would have taken very few votes to flip the result.
Well, let me make sure everybody understands that this information is in the family, right? And one of the commitments that Ken Martin and Jane Klebb, who's the head of the state Democratic committees, Jane is kind of a making partisan voter reg great again, kind of, champion, that, part of the money in the new DNCs, this huge investment the DNC is making in state parties, this unprecedented investment that they're making in state parties. Part of the reason they're doing this is in order for state parties to get back into the partisan voter registration game. And we're going to have to invent all this. I mean, there's lots of new tools now. It's not like we're going to go back and do what we did 20 years ago. But for those of you who want to be part of solving this problem for us or making it better, volunteer for your local and state parties and tell them you want to be in the when their voter registration system sort of starts to kick in, that you want to be part of that effort, and to help encourage them to move to a more aggressive stance as early as possible. Because, we basically have been, tactically, we got beat here, right? By execution on the ground over a long period of time, over 4 years, that was terribly costly for us. And, and I think one of the things that Tom and I have talked about, and I hope, Tom, that we can figure out how to do this, is I'm encouraging Tom to sort of build a dashboard that creates sort of a regular way for us to look at the progress we're making in voter registration. So this isn't something that we could argue that we didn't understand or that we didn't know was happening, right? And in order for there to be a public report card on how we're doing in voter registration in the states where we can track that, right, in a partisan way, so that this isn't a surprise, because this is going to have an impact. This played a role in us, not winning the House. This played a role in, given how close the House was in both of the last two elections, the investment they made in growing and changing their electorate and making it more Republican, could have been the difference between us winning and losing the House in each of these two last elections. And so this is a party-wide challenge now that we have to meet. And it's not something that we've done for a long time, and I want to encourage, and I think each state may end up coming at it in a different way. But certainly one of the things that I think about, Tom, is that the 7 million people who gave money to the Harris campaign and to the Biden campaign and the DNC last cycle, we have to ask all of them to help us do this voter registration. That is part of what it means to be a good Democrat and a loyal Democrat and a Democrat who cares about the country. And it means, helping out, having some way of registering your friends and encouraging them to register, whether it's a single national website, whether it's a toolkit. We've got to sort of make this as something that we all kind of do, in our work, and keep it front of mind for us, as in addition to sort of the more traditional ways that you roll out tactical voter registration drives.
Yeah, I mean, a few things on that. Number one, your point about the dashboard, we will do that. We will get that together and we'll share that. Like Simon said, we're working on a way to be able to share that with this community and then more broadly. I think it's important to have that report card to see the work we're doing. I do want to take a quick second. There's been a lot of talk in the DC press, especially in the last couple of weeks. You mentioned Ken Martin and Jane Club and the work they're doing. Not surprisingly, Ken Martin has been taking some attacks from, I think, those who were probably upset that he got elected in the first place. I want to make an important point in the context of this and what we're talking about, voter registration data. The most important job of the DNC chair is to provide the resources, the tools, the guidance, the structure, the infrastructure for state parties, for Democratic organizers, campaigns, candidates, to do the work they do. They can't wave a wand and make things better in a week or two, as I think we all wish they could. And to that extent, the work that Ken Martin has done already, you mentioned investments in state parties, historic investments, the work they're doing on the tech and infrastructure side, it will pay dividends. It is already paying dividends in some of these races. So, I think they're doing an incredible job. And it's important that we continue to back them and the work they do, because they're empowering these state and local party organizations in ways that where the resources just haven't been there in the past. So I don't think they get enough credit for that.
I mean, one of the most amazing stats, Jane has come on to Hopium. She's Nebraska chair, old friend of mine. She's now the president of the state chairs across the country, state party committees. Do you know that only 10 of the 50 state party chairs are paid? 40 of the 50 state party chairs in America are volunteer. And just think about how much money there is in our system.
It's crazy.
Right? I mean, there's billions and billions and billions of dollars in center left politics. And we have not found a way to pay state party chairs to allow them to work full time. This is part of the thing that Ken and Jane and the team there are trying to solve, is that we have chronically underinvested for a long time in our state party and national party infrastructure. And what everyone needs to realize is that, this is the biggest set of institutions that we have in our party to advance Democrats. And what we should want, in my view right now, is for every part of our family to be operating at the highest possible capacity they can in a time of national crisis. And we have had the party infrastructure chronically underinvested, underperforming what it could and its special role. And Ken and Jane have come in, to a large part, and the central reason that Ken won his election against Ben Wickler, a dear friend of ours and a wonderful guy, is that there was a sense that he could come in and really modernize the national infrastructure of the party and sort of get it more robust. And look, we have been overperforming in elections all across the country this year. There's encouragement here. And I will say, I agree with you, Tom, that I have confidence that Ken and his team, along with the state chairs, are going to be able to build the sort of most muscular, robust party infrastructure that we've had in a very long time. And I'm excited to see what that's going to be able to do for us, starting in the elections in November in New Jersey and Virginia.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Any final thoughts before we go? And I'm grateful for you being here today, Tom. It's always good to see you, my friend, and I really enjoyed the presentation. It's a little nerdy, but you gotta.
That's me.
We like data, right? No, we're data people here, right? And but any final thoughts before we cut out of here?
Yeah, well, again, just thanks for having me. Thanks for this community, for everything you do. Y'all continue to be an inspiration, and I appreciate every time I get to come here. And again, I think the positive takeaway here is having this clarity of understanding of what happened and seeing a problem that is very much solvable, and seeing the opportunity in front of us, to me is encouraging and empowering. And so we're going to continue to report back as we see the progress in the coming weeks and months. So I'll hopefully be back with y'all sometime soon to share some good news.
Thanks, brother. It's good to see you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend all, and keep fighting hard.